The plane was falling from the sky and everyone was going to die in 3 minutes, but the woman in seat 14C just closed her book and stood up like she was getting ready to leave a coffee shop. First Officer Marcus Chen was screaming into the radio that both engines were dead, the captain was passed out with blood running down his face, and all 183 passengers were crying and praying as the Boeing 777 dropped like a stone through the clouds over the Pacific Ocean. But nobody noticed the quiet woman with brown hair walking calmly toward the cockpit while oxygen masks swung wildly around her head and luggage flew through the cabin like missiles. Before you dive into this story, tell me, which country are you from? Comment below. Subscribe now because tomorrow I'm dropping the best story yet. You don't want to miss it. Her name was Alex Morgan and she looked like a school teacher or maybe someone who worked in an office, wearing jeans and a plain blue sweater with comfortable walking shoes. She was 38 years old with tired eyes and no makeup, carrying a paperback novel about gardening. When she boarded the flight from Tokyo to Los Angeles 6 hours earlier, the flight attendant smiled at her the same way she smiled at everyone else. The businessman in seat 14B asked her what she did for work and she said something vague about consulting that made him lose interest. Nobody on that plane knew that Alex Morgan had a call sign that made F-22 pilots stand up straighter when they heard it. Nobody knew she had flown more combat missions than almost anyone alive, or that she had shot down enemy aircraft while pulling maneuvers that broke every rule in the book. She had retired from the Air Force 8 months ago after 20 years of service, and she deliberately chose this life of being invisible because she was tired of people treating her like she was made of something different than regular human beings. The plane had been cruising normally at 37,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean when Alex felt the first shutter run through the aircraft, a vibration that was wrong in a way that most passengers would not notice but that made her fingers tighten on her book. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom, trying to sound calm but with an edge that Alex recognized as barely controlled fear. He said they were experiencing technical difficulties and needed to descend to a lower altitude. 30 seconds later, both engines exploded at the same time. Not a Hollywood fireball explosion, but a rapid failure where critical turbine blades disintegrated and tore through engine housings while fuel lines ruptured and hydraulic systems failed. The plane lurched violently to the left and then dropped, falling in a sickening plunge that lifted passengers against their seatbelts. The oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments and emergency lights started flashing red. Alex had her oxygen mask on before anyone else because her combat training made her move without thinking. The businessman next to her was praying with his eyes closed and his mask hanging loose because his hands were shaking too hard to secure it. She reached over and fixed his mask for him, pressing it tight against his face while she told him to breathe slow and deep. The plane was still falling and Alex knew they had maybe 3 minutes before impact with the ocean. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, gripping the seats to keep from falling as the aircraft shook and dropped. A flight attendant yelled at her to sit down immediately, but Alex ignored her and started moving toward the cockpit, pulling herself forward hand over hand while the cabin tilted at a crazy angle. She reached the cockpit door and looked inside. Captain James Wheeler was unconscious, slumped against his harness with blood running down his face. First Officer Marcus Chen was in the right seat, 26 years old and flying his first year on wide-body aircraft, and his hands were frozen on the controls while sweat poured down his face. Alex stepped into the cockpit and put her hand on Marcus Chen's shoulder. She spoke in a voice that cut through his panic. She told him her name was Alex Morgan, call sign Viper, retired Air Force fighter pilot with 4,000 hours in tactical aircraft, and she was taking command effective immediately. Marcus stared at her with wild eyes, so she grabbed his shoulder harder and told him again. She asked him for a systems report, quick and clean, tell me everything that is broken. Marcus stammered that both engines had failed, they had lost 2 of 3 hydraulic systems and the third was dropping fast, and they were in an unpowered descent with limited flight control. Alex looked at the instruments and saw they were dropping through 28,000 feet at 4,000 feet per minute, which gave them exactly 7 minutes until they hit the ocean. She told Marcus to get the captain out of his seat and strap him into the jump seat, then get back here. Marcus started pulling the unconscious captain backward while Alex slid into the left seat, feeling the yoke in her hands. The controls felt mushy and unresponsive because of the hydraulic failures, but there was still some authority left if she used them exactly right. Marcus got back into the right seat and Alex told him to stop transmitting Mayday calls because air traffic control could not help them now. She asked him how many flying hours he had and he said 4,000 hours total, 800 in type on the 777. She told him that was good enough, she needed him to be her co-pilot and do exactly what she said without question. Marcus nodded and Alex saw his hands steady a little because someone had taken command. They were passing through 24,000 feet and Alex pulled back on the yoke, trading altitude for airspeed in a careful balance. The rate of descent decreased from 4,000 feet per minute to 3,000. She told Marcus to activate the ram air turbine, the emergency system that would drop a small turbine into the airstream to generate electrical power and minimal hydraulic pressure. The ram air turbine deployed and some of the red warning lights changed to amber as minimal power returned to critical systems. She told Marcus to pull up the fuel system display and he showed her that both wings still had thousands of gallons of jet fuel even though the engines were dead. Alex stared at that fuel reading and an idea formed in her mind, an idea that was absolutely insane and violated every commercial aviation regulation ever written. She had done something similar once in an F-16 when her engine had failed over enemy territory. She asked Marcus if he knew how to manually dump fuel and he said yes. Why would they need to dump fuel when they were already falling? She told him to shut up and listen. The plane was essentially a glider now with terrible glide characteristics. But if she dumped fuel in a very specific way while using the remaining control surfaces, she could create an imbalance that would force the plane into a banking turn without using engine thrust. She could use gravity and momentum to bring the nose around toward the west, back toward the chain of small islands that were maybe 200 miles away, islands with emergency airstrips. Marcus looked at her like she had lost her mind and said that would never work. Alex told him she had done the math in her head and they had enough altitude to glide 180 miles if she managed their energy perfectly, and there was an island called Midway Atoll with a runway long enough to land a 777, it was exactly 173 miles to the west. Alex told him to start dumping fuel from the right wing tanks, maximum flow rate, do it now. He hesitated, but Alex snapped at him in a voice that sounded like a fighter pilot giving orders during combat, and he activated the dump valves. Fuel started streaming from the right wing and Alex felt the plane start to respond as the weight distribution changed. She used the hydraulic pressure to bank the aircraft to the right, and the nose started to swing around. The plane was turning but still falling, dropping through 18,000 feet. She told Marcus to stop the fuel dump, then dump from the left wing. The weight shifted again and Alex used the momentum to steepen the turn, bringing the nose around until they were pointed west. She leveled the wings and looked at the instruments. They were at 16,000 feet with a descent rate of 2,000 feet per minute. Marcus calculated their glide ratio and said they could glide approximately 160 miles, which meant they would fall into the ocean 20 miles short of Midway. Alex told him 20 miles was nothing. She looked at the wing configuration and saw the flaps were retracted. If she extended the flaps just 5 degrees, she could change the wing's lift and reduce the sink rate without creating too much drag. She told Marcus to extend flaps to 5 degrees. He looked at her with fear but reached for the flap lever. The flaps started extending and Alex felt the aircraft shudder. The descent rate decreased from 2,000 feet per minute to 1,500. Marcus ran the numbers again and said they could now glide 178 miles, which meant they would still fall short by 5 miles. Alex asked about the weather at Midway and he read that winds were from the east at 15 knots, which meant they would have a tailwind. The tailwind would give them maybe 3 extra miles, which still left them 2 miles short. Then she remembered something from her fighter pilot training, a technique that stunt pilots used. She told Marcus to watch what she did. She pushed the yoke forward and let the nose drop, trading altitude for airspeed. When they hit 290 knots she pulled back hard, converting that airspeed back into altitude in a smooth arc that brought them up 500 feet before the speed bled off. It was called a porpoise maneuver and it was dangerous in a commercial aircraft, but Alex had just bought them 500 feet of extra altitude, which translated to maybe 3 more miles of glide distance. She told him they were going to do it again and again, porpoising across the sky, trading speed for altitude and altitude for distance until they reached Midway or ran out of air. They porpoised down through 12,000 feet, through 10,000, through 8,000, through 6,000. Marcus checked their position and said Midway was 60 miles ahead, they were going to make it. But making it to Midway was only half the problem because they still had to land. They were at 4,000 feet and Midway was 30 miles ahead, close enough that Alex could see it through the windscreen. She told Marcus to extend the landing gear. He looked at her like she was crazy because extending the gear would create massive drag, but that was exactly what Alex wanted. Marcus extended the landing gear and the plane shuddered as the wheels lowered, creating so much drag that they dropped from 4,000 feet to 2,000 feet in less than a minute. She told Marcus to extend flaps to 30 degrees and he did it, and the nose pitched down hard. 1,000 feet altitude and the runway was right in front of them. She leveled the wings and aimed for the numbers at the start of the runway. She was high and fast and had no engines to correct with, so she did something that would have gotten her failed in any flight school. She entered a forward slip, crossing the controls to make the aircraft fly sideways through the air, presenting the fuselage to the wind like an air brake. The plane was falling at 3,000 feet per minute and shaking so hard that Marcus was gripping his armrests and praying, but Alex held the slip until they were 500 feet above the ground and lined up with the runway. Then she kicked the rudder and leveled the wings. They crossed the threshold at 200 feet, way too high, way too fast. The wheels touched down hard and the tires screamed as they hit concrete at 190 knots. Alex stood on the brakes. She told Marcus to deploy the speed brakes. They were rolling down the runway at 150 knots, 130, 110, and Alex could see the end of the runway coming up fast. 90 knots, 70 knots, 50 knots, and the runway end was 500 feet away, then 300, then 100, and the aircraft rolled to a complete stop with 50 feet of concrete remaining between them and the water. Alex sat back in the seat and took her first full breath in what felt like an hour. Marcus was crying, tears running down his face while he laughed and cried at the same time, and he reached over and grabbed Alex's hand. She squeezed back and told him he did good work. The emergency vehicles surrounded the plane and Alex told Marcus to evacuate the passengers. She helped the flight attendants deploy the emergency slides and guide people toward the exits. The passengers evacuated quickly, and Alex was about to slide down herself when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a radio transmission coming through the cockpit speakers, a voice on the military emergency frequency. It was the distinctive tone of an F-22 Raptor pilot. The F-22 pilot said, "Viper, this is Falcon 2-1, we have been monitoring your situation and observed your approach and landing, requesting confirmation of your identity." Alex stood frozen because she did not understand how F-22 pilots knew her call sign, and then she remembered that the military tracked all aircraft emergencies and someone had looked up the passenger manifest. She walked back to the cockpit and picked up the radio microphone. She transmitted, "Falcon 2-1, this is Viper, identity confirmed, all passengers and crew are safe." There was silence for a few seconds and then another voice came on. "Viper, Falcon 2-2, we just wanted to say it is an honor to share the sky with you. What you just did was impossible and you made it look easy." A third voice came on, and this one had the gravelly tone of a senior pilot. "Viper, this is Falcon 2-0, we have all heard the stories about you, about the missions you flew and the people you saved, and now we just watched you save 183 more. We wanted you to know that your call sign still means something up here. It means never giving up even when the situation is hopeless." Alex pressed the transmit button and her voice was rougher than she wanted when she said, "Falcon 2-0, thank you, that means more than you know, Viper out." She hung up the microphone and turned around to find Marcus standing in the cockpit doorway, staring at her. He asked her if those were really F-22 pilots talking about her call sign, and who exactly was she. Alex realized there was no point in hiding anymore, so she told him the truth. She told him her call sign was Viper and she had earned it during her third combat deployment when she shot down 4 enemy aircraft in a single mission while protecting a rescue helicopter. She told him she had flown F-16s for 12 years and then transitioned to F-22s, and she had eventually commanded a fighter squadron. She had logged over 500 combat hours and had been awarded the Silver Star. When they told her she was too valuable to risk in combat anymore, she had retired. Marcus asked her why she was not still in the cockpit where she belonged, and Alex told him she was tired of war and tired of watching friends die. She told him she wanted to grow roses and read books and be anonymous, but apparently the universe had other plans. The passengers were gathering on the runway, and someone had told them that the woman who saved them was a decorated fighter pilot. Alex climbed down the emergency slide and tried to blend into the crowd, but Marcus came down behind her and announced to everyone that this was the woman who saved them. This was Viper, this was a legend. The passengers turned toward her and for a moment there was silence, and then someone started clapping and someone else joined in, and within seconds all 183 passengers and crew members were applauding. The businessman from seat 14B pushed through the crowd and grabbed her shoulders. He told her he had 2 daughters at home and he was supposed to walk his oldest daughter down the aisle at her wedding next month, and because of Alex he was going to be there. She walked away from the crowd and stood at the edge of the runway looking out at the ocean. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see a young Air Force officer approaching, wearing a flight suit with F-22 squadron patches. He saluted her. The officer told her his name was Captain Ryan Mitchell, call sign Falcon 2-1, and he had been on patrol when he heard the emergency calls. He told her that when they confirmed her identity through the passenger manifest, every F-22 pilot in the air had switched to the emergency frequency to listen. He told her that back at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, pilots were gathering to watch the news coverage, and her name was being spoken with reverence. Alex asked him why it mattered so much to them, why her call sign still carried weight when she had been retired for 8 months. Captain Mitchell told her that call signs like Viper were not just names, they were standards that other pilots measured themselves against. He told her that when training got hard and missions seemed impossible, instructors told them about Viper, about the fighter pilot who never gave up. He told her that her legacy was not in the past, it was in every pilot who pushed themselves harder because they wanted to be worthy of flying in the same sky that she had flown in. Alex listened to this and felt something shift inside her. She had thought she could leave the military and leave behind the weight of being someone that other people looked up to, but Captain Mitchell was showing her that legacy was not something you could retire from. She asked him what happened now, and he told her that was up to her, but the Air Force would welcome her back in any capacity she chose. She thought about that offer and about the garden she had planned to plant and the quiet life she had thought she wanted, and she realized that maybe she had been wrong about what would make her happy. Maybe happiness was not found in escaping responsibility but in accepting it. She told Captain Mitchell she would think about it, she would consider coming back in some role that let her train the next generation of pilots. The sun was setting over Midway Atoll. Alex sat on the runway with her back against one of the landing gear tires and watched the sunset, feeling the warmth of being alive. Marcus Chin sat down next to her and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally Marcus said that when he woke up this morning in Tokyo, he had been thinking about his career and wondering if he would ever be more than just an average pilot, and now he had helped save 183 lives alongside a living legend. Alex told him he had not just helped, he had been essential. She told him that being a good pilot was not about flying perfect approaches in perfect weather, it was about keeping your head when everything went wrong and finding solutions when the rulebook said there were no solutions left. As night fell over Midway, someone started a fire near the runway, and the passengers gathered around it. Someone had found a guitar and was playing soft music, and people were sharing food and telling stories. Alex sat at the edge of the group watching them, and she understood that this was what made flying worth all the risk and fear and responsibility, these moments when you looked at people who were alive because of choices you made. She stood up and walked toward the damaged 777 sitting at the end of the runway, its engines destroyed but its fuselage intact and every passenger seat empty because everyone had walked away alive. She put her hand on the landing gear and felt the metal still warm from the friction of the landing, and she made a decision. She would go back to the Air Force in whatever capacity they wanted her, she would train pilots and share her knowledge. She would accept that being Viper was not just a call sign from her past, it was who she was and who she would always be. The next morning, a fleet of Coast Guard and Air Force transport aircraft arrived to evacuate the passengers to Hawaii. Alex tried to avoid the cameras but the passengers insisted that she be recognized, and eventually she agreed to one press conference where she stood next to Marcus and answered questions. The reporters asked her how she stayed calm when everyone was panicking, and she told them that panic was a choice and she chose not to make it because panic killed people. They asked her how she learned to fly a commercial aircraft without engines, and she told them she learned by spending 20 years in situations where the rulebook did not apply and survival required creativity and skill and a refusal to give up. The press conference ended and Alex walked toward the C-130 that would take her to Hawaii, and as she climbed the ramp she heard jet engines overhead and looked up to see 4 F-22 Raptors flying in perfect formation above the island. They were flying a missing man formation, the aerial salute that fighter pilots used to honor fallen comrades, except this time they were honoring someone who was very much alive. The 4 jets flew across the island in tight formation and then one of them broke away and climbed toward the sky, leaving a gap that represented the honored pilot. She stood at the top of the ramp with tears running down her face while the F-22s completed their salute and then came back around for one more pass. As they passed overhead she heard their voices on her handheld radio. One by one each F-22 pilot spoke her call sign over the radio, just that one word, Viper, spoken with respect and pride and brotherhood, and Alex raised her hand in salute to them. The 4 F-22s climbed back into the sky and disappeared into the clouds, and Alex lowered her hand and walked into the C-130. She found a seat near the window and looked out at Midway Atoll growing smaller below her, at the runway where she had landed a dead aircraft and saved 183 lives. When the C-130 landed at Hickam Air Force Base, there was a crowd waiting on the tarmac, hundreds of aviators standing at attention to welcome her home. The wing commander was at the front of the formation, and when Alex walked down the ramp he saluted her. She returned the salute and he told her that the Air Force was honored to have her back, that her office was ready and her first class of students was waiting. Alex looked at the assembled pilots and saw young faces and old faces, fighter pilots and transport pilots and helicopter pilots, and she understood that she was looking at her family. She had tried to leave this family and live as a civilian, but today had shown her that you could not leave family. She told the wing commander she was ready to start immediately. That evening, Alex stood in her new office at Hickam looking at the walls that were already decorated with photos of F-22s and F-16s, aircraft she had flown and loved. There was a plaque on the desk with her call sign engraved on it. She sat down and pulled out a notepad and started writing her curriculum for the first class of students she would train. She wrote about decision-making under pressure, about using every resource available even when the situation seemed hopeless. She wrote about the responsibility of holding people's lives in your hands, about understanding that every decision you made in the cockpit rippled outward to affect families and communities and futures. She wrote about technical skills and tactical maneuvers, but mostly she wrote about mindset and attitude and the refusal to accept defeat. Captain Mitchell knocked on her door and told her that the investigation into United Flight 2847 was already underway, and early findings suggested that the dual-engine failure was caused by a manufacturing defect that affected multiple aircraft in the fleet, and her emergency landing had potentially saved hundreds of other lives by identifying the problem before more aircraft failed. Boeing was grounding similar aircraft for emergency inspections. He told her one more thing, that the story of Flight 2847 had spread beyond military aviation, that commercial pilots around the world were studying what she did, and that airlines were updating their emergency procedures based on the techniques she had used. Her one landing had potentially changed commercial aviation safety forever. The sun set over Hickam Air Force Base and Alex stood at her window watching F-22s taking off for evening training missions. She thought about the businessman who would walk his daughter down the aisle, about the grandmother who would hold her grandchild, about the young couple who would build a life together, about all the futures that existed because she refused to let an aircraft fall from the sky. The last F-22 of the evening took off and climbed toward the stars, and Alex watched it until it disappeared into the darkness. She turned away from the window and looked at her desk covered with lesson plans and training schedules, and she smiled because she knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was meant to do. She was Viper, and tomorrow she would begin training the next generation of pilots who would carry that same commitment to excellence and that same refusal to let people die when there was any chance that skill and determination could save them. She was home, not in a place but in a purpose, and she would never run from that purpose again. Marcus Chin appeared in her doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, and he handed one to her without saying anything. They stood together looking out at the airfield. She asked Marcus what he was going to do next, and he told her he had already submitted his application to transfer to the Air Force. He had already listed her as his preferred instructor. Alex nodded and told him she would accept him into her program, but he needed to understand that she would be harder on him than anyone else because she knew what he was capable of. Marcus smiled and said he would not want it any other way. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Marcus said that before today he had thought being a hero meant doing something extraordinary that nobody else could do, but now he understood that being a hero meant doing what needed to be done even when it was terrifying, even when it seemed impossible. He said Alex had shown him that heroism was not about being fearless, it was about being afraid and doing it anyway. The base was quiet now. Alex told Marcus to go home and get some rest. Marcus headed for the door, but he stopped and turned back to thank her one more time. Alex told him to stop thanking her and start preparing, because when he showed up for training she would push him harder than he had ever been pushed. She sat back down at her desk and continued writing her curriculum, thinking about all the pilots who would sit in her classroom and learn from her. She thought about the ripple effect of her work, how teaching one pilot could save hundreds of lives over the course of a career. She finished her curriculum at midnight and leaned back in her chair. She had saved 183 lives today, but more importantly she had remembered who she was and why she had become a pilot in the first place. She had become a pilot because she wanted to protect people, because she wanted to master a skill that few people ever mastered. Alex stood up and walked to the window one last time, looking out at the darkened airfield where F-22s sat waiting for tomorrow's missions. She put her hand on the glass and made a promise to herself and to every pilot who would train under her. She promised that she would never let another pilot face an impossible situation unprepared, that she would share everything she knew and demand excellence in return. She smiled and turned away from the window, picked up her curriculum and her coffee cup, and walked out of her office ready to begin the next chapter of her life. She was Viper, and she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, and for the first time in 8 months she felt complete. Tomorrow she would stand in front of her first class of students and tell them the story of Flight 2847, and she would use that story to teach them about responsibility and courage and the refusal to accept defeat. She would tell them that being a pilot was the greatest privilege and the heaviest burden, and if they were not willing to accept both, they should leave now before they got someone killed. And when her students graduated and went on to fly their own missions, when they faced their own emergencies and made their own impossible decisions, they would carry with them the lessons of Viper, the legend who came out of retirement to save 183 lives and then came back to make sure that future pilots could do the same. Alex walked out of the building into the warm Hawaiian night, breathing in the smell of jet fuel and ocean salt, and she felt at peace for the first time since she had retired. She had tried to run from her calling, tried to be someone she was not, but the universe had put her on that flight for a reason. She had been given a second chance to do what she did best, and she was not going to waste it. She was Viper and her work was not done, it was just beginning.